I'm Matt Dragonstone, and welcome to today's episode of the Dragonstone podcast. Today we're joined by Kelsie Skye. Kelsie is a writer and occultist from Missouri in the United States, and the interview is pretty awesome. We talk about death, which, isn't awesome, I suppose. It's not really anything when you really think about it, but we talk about death and then we talk about writing. And before we cut to the interview, I wanted to just have a quick chat about the way in which astrology can be very on the nose sometimes. I originally wanted to interview Kelsie about a month ago, but we had a couple of, near misses. She had to cancel one week, I had to cancel the next week. And it seemed like forces were conspiring to keep our conversation delayed until the appropriate time. I'd always wanted to talk to Kelsie about death, which is the primary topic of today's interview. And it came to pass that the interview itself took place on the day of the Saturn-Mercury-Sun cazimi. I hadn't planned this, but it's interesting when we think about the sun, when we think about Saturn, when we think about Mercury. It's just very funny that we ended up talking about death on the day that Mercury and Saturn were both conjoining the sun in a very, very tight aspect. And even the structure of the interview itself takes that kind of tone. The first part is about death, and it's a really interesting conversation. Kelsie's got this amazing story to her life and her praxis. And then we talk about writing, because that very morning Kelsie had started a Substack where she intended to put all of her written work. I'll be linking to that in the show notes, by the way. So on the day that the Sun and Saturn and Mercury all got together, I managed to finally record an interview where we talked about writing and death. Funny stuff. Anyway, on with the show. Usual self-promotion applies. Check out dragonstoneastrology.com, buy a talisman, get a reading, read an article. Check it out. It's a great place to be. Ciao for now. Bye. Okay, so today on the podcast, I'm joined by Kelsie Skye. She's a creative writer, a medium, an occultist, and she's dropped by the podcast today to talk a little bit about a cheery topic to go along with the Saturn cazimi on which we're recording the episode. We're going to talk about death. Welcome to the podcast, Kelsie. How's it going?
Matt, thanks for having me.
We were just talking before about how you're from Missouri in the United States of America.
Yes.
And I personally only know about Missouri from the Grandpa Simpson quote about being deep down in the cold, hard ground before he'll recognize Missouri. And you very kindly gave me a history lesson about the state. Interestingly, you also described it as liminal, and also informed me that not many people, even in the United States, know about Missouri. Is that right?
Proportionally, no. Probably most of the people. I lived in Orlando for a couple years and have obviously known a lot of people on the internet. And most people from the East and West Coasts couldn't necessarily pick out Missouri on a map. Probably most of the people on your podcast could, if they're from America, because I imagine most of the people listening to your podcast probably care more about geography than others, but
I think there's a vested interest in geography, simply because the listenership that I'm aware of is quite dispersed between the United States, Europe, and Australia, and it's always nice to have a variety of guests on. And I was just saying that you're probably one of the first people from the South, the quote-unquote South. I'm going to call Missouri the South. I don't know if that's going to start another war or not. But yeah, you're probably one of the first that I've recorded with. So very special, very rare.
Well,
Thank
I know
you for
you've
coming
had
on.
Zamboni on, and he actually lived just up the way from me. We haven't actually gotten together to hang out yet, but we're planning on it at some point. It keeps getting put off because of weather.
Yeah, that's true. I keep forgetting that Zamboni was on. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, he's
so
about
the second
hour 20 minutes north of me.
that's interesting.
But he's from a much more urbane sort of a cultural center in the state, whereas I'm from the Ozarks, which is I'm from the southern part of Missouri originally. The Ozarks are basically, you could think of it, if people are familiar with Appalachia. Most of the people who came to the Ozarks settled there from Appalachia because it's basically like it's actually older. I mean, people talk about how old Appalachia is. The geography and the geology of the Ozarks are theoretically actually older, and they're worn down. So they're like the Appalachian Mountains. If you cut them in half, they call them the Ozark Mountains, but they're more just like big hills, but they're really pretty. And it's a very rural, slightly more southern than northern vibe, but it's also, when I lived in Louisiana when I was a kid for 2 years, they called us Yankees. So
it's interesting for two reasons. First of all, Missouri seems to be featuring prominently on the podcast at the moment. And secondly, Missouri's, as you described beforehand, a liminal state, which I think is really an interesting jumping off point for the topic for today's discussion, which is, what's on the other side of the liminal state, basically, which is death and the afterlife. Ozarks aside, I'm from Australia, so my cultural content that I consume about the Ozarks and the Appalachian area is pretty coloured by popular culture. I have no lived experience of that area, but it seems mysterious, and it seems, I guess, like you described earlier, liminal. There seems to be parts of that space that can kind of exist in two worlds at once. Did you have any experiences when you were young of that liminality and the way in which the veil between the worlds might be a bit thinner from your way?
So yes, in liminality and borders between life and death have featured heavily in my magical practice since before I really thought of it as a magical practice. When I was a kid, I had an NDE drowning experience in a waterfall in the woods near my house, in which I had this, those memories are real hazy, and I'm trying to kind of hash through them in some of my creative writing work. But anyway, it was a very strange experience that kicked off a bunch of changes in my life. And then we moved to Louisiana for 2 years and then back to Missouri and kind of moved all over the state. So I've lived in this all over this, basically about 2/3 of this state. And it's a very liminal area because, as I was saying, it was one of the main territories that was seeking to become a state right before the Civil War. And so it occupied this politically liminal position that was really wound up, the struggle over how that worked wound up relating directly to the kickoff of the Civil War. A bunch of the failed compromises were about Missouri and a couple other states joining the Congress, and all of that, of course, was about slavery. But the actual political nitty gritty of it, Missouri was right in the middle, and I was born about, I guess, 20 minutes north of the Mason-Dixon line, and grew up thinking about that, and featuring and I was homeschooled as a child, so I was always outside of the norm, so to speak. And then when I had several NDEs when I was 23. After, I mean, I could obviously go on about my life for a long time, but the NDEs wound up being kind of related to kicking off a multi-year initiation process in my 20s. That was kind of a mental health disaster of me I had been a very strongly believing evangelical Christian and had serious faith along those lines as a child. And then about the time I went off to college, I had the first spirit experience that I had was with Jesus. In a way that I didn't, because I was evangelical, borderline charismatic, non-denominational Christian, and I didn't have a Catholic saints framework for dealing with that.
Yep.
And it was a very intense, ecstatic experience that happened just as I was getting ready to leave for college. And then I had NDEs when I was in college and started hearing, hearing isn't quite the right word, but I started experiencing other thought patterns in my head that were not, or didn't originate with me. So, and I started questioning my religion and my gender, which I was raised as a boy. I go through life as a woman now. And so I had a lot of change, a lot of radical change packed into 4 or 5 years related to my NDEs as part of it, and I got a pacemaker at age 23 because that was the treatment that was on the table at the time. And so there's a lot of death and change and liminality in my life. I don't really, like I was saying when we're trying to come up with an intro for me, my experiences take more words than there really are. So, but I spend a lot of time because I like playing with words, both in writing and just when I'm talking, and I always have that. I'm always trying to fit words around them, and they never do. But my experiences never quite fit fully into words. But it's a fun thing to try.
Interesting. So just from the biography that you've shared, growing up evangelical, strongly evangelical, borderline charismatic, there would have been a framework, not the Catholic saints framework, but probably there would have been an afterlife, a concept of the afterlife that you would have had quite definitively embedded in your young psyche by
Yes,
virtue of
very much.
the religion.
It's pretty much the stereotypical heaven, hell, no in between. You get one life, and you'd better follow the teachings that your particular church have about it, or you're going to hell. So,
Yep. Yeah, no in between.
But it was also weird because my dad ran an NPR station, so public radio tends to be very like liberal and culturally informed. And my dad was a musician, and both of my parents came into this evangelical Christian thing from the post-hippie Jesus movement, which was basically a bunch of people who decided to give up LSD and try God. And like my mom was dating a guy was engaged to a guy like that when she met to a drug dealer actually who was dealing LSD and mushrooms and stuff. LSD and acid. I almost redundant there. But so like I grew up in this really we listened to oldies and hippie music and also like Christian rock and praise music, so foot in both worlds all the way, and listening to NPR like
You know, I listen to NPR sometimes in Australia. I like it. It's nice and soft, and it's
well
not
produced.
as commercial. Yeah. Yeah, it is well
and it was
produced.
way less produced back in the 80s. So
I'm sure. Look, we had the same like post-hippie sort of Protestants running around with acoustic guitars thing in Australia.
Yes.
And we have our fair share of evangelicals. And I know from the recovering evangelicals that I know, including some that are part of really quite literally exclusive communities of Christian practice, that to have an experience that doesn't conform to the biblical narrative around heaven can be massively destabilizing. And I don't want to touch too much on, the exact details of your NDEs, because I'm aware that for some people, like talking about it is a bit traumatic. But what I'm interested in is young Kelsie would have been very much within that mindset still, I'm imagining, on your way off to college, for instance, when an NDE would have probably shown you an aspect of the liminal space between life and death that didn't conform to, the heaven, hell, Jesus, sinners and true believers kind of narrative. Was that the case, or did you still manage to interpret that through an evangelical lens, or were you already at that point of questioning?
The NDE was hazy enough that I could kind of sidestep it. What I couldn't sidestep was the accompanying spirit experiences, which preceded it. And then when I had the NDEs, the spirits kind of presented it to me as an initiatory experience. And I actually felt for several years that I'd failed it because I bowed to my family pressure and got the pacemaker, which disrupted my sleep patterns massively for a couple years because they couldn't get it tuned right. And so I had really bad dream life for a couple years, and the whole time I was trying to process all these mediumship, for lack of a better word, experiences, and my sense of ego kind of shattered, and I wound up engaging with like online communities related to multiple personalities, which I kind of think I fit into, but also I just kind of don't buy the psychiatric models and the psychiatric models on that kind of stuff have never been very good at all, or even very certain that the whole thing is possible to begin with. So I just never fit into a coherent pigeonhole. And so it was actually really hard to engage with other people, and I didn't really start to feel comfortable in my own skin until just right, like probably the leading edge of my Saturn return, which, because of the state of my Saturn in my chart, was actually one of the happiest times of my life. Because I'd basically kind of been put through the ringer earlier, and it's like, okay, here's the payoff. This is the way Saturn works too. Congratulations, Saturn in Libra and rising Capricorn.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, folks, for those playing along at home, I'm not going to share all the details of Kelsey's chart, but she has a magnificent Saturn. Like, fantastic Saturn. One of those early 80s kind of crop of the Saturn and Libra kids that we all know and love, basically. And yeah, I mean, I won't do the whole do you think you're a millennial or a Gen Xer, because you've got the very best of both in that chart. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it's been weird, and it's one of my favorite things about the time that I was born, actually, is getting to see this foot in both worlds of having, it's really the internet as the defining, because I also was exposed to technology early, because I was on the internet and playing around with the internet at the college campus that my dad ran the NPR station out of when I was like 9 or 10.
Yeah.
So that was like 91 or 92.
Yeah, those are early days. We didn't get it over here until late 90s, mid to late 90s. Universities had it, I think, from about 94 over here onwards for broader consumption amongst the student body and things like that. But we were a bit of a cultural backward.
In that sense, I very much got the millennial thing.
Yeah, true.
But also I got a lot of the Gen X culture.
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting time, that early 80s period. So you've got these experiences, and then you've got the spirit contact that comes with that. And I'm interested in not just your own personal experiential kind of, opening into death, but also what the spirits were telling you about death and the types of information that they were kind of conveying to you about the process, about what happens afterwards, your own deductions about that based off that information. If you don't mind sharing a little bit, that would be super duper interesting.
Well, so probably my most, aside from Jesus, who I haven't had any direct spirit contact with. Well, I mean, I've had some casual spirit contact with him since that big ecstatic experience where he basically said that I was going to be led to be more like him in ways that people were not going to expect. Not because I literally, that resulted because of me praying a really dangerous prayer, which is that I was extremely depressed, trying to process all this stuff. And I said, I don't care what it takes, even if you have to break me to put me back together again.
Yep.
Make me healthier and more like you in loving other people.
Oh, wow.
And so I just got radically shaken out of the evangelical faith. It's funny because I managed to wind up mostly skipping. A lot of people who leave evangelical stuff wind up going through an atheistic phase, and I did not. I had a long dark night of the soul for several years, but I decided early on that if there wasn't any if spirituality wasn't real, if there wasn't any spirit, I didn't want to live in that world. And so it was one of those, it was either suicide or just expand my spiritual worldview. And these spirits that were engaging with me, one of whom identified himself as an angel of death, which are not the angels that they're there in the Christian lore, but they're real obscure in the Christian and Jewish lore. And he basically introduced himself to me as one of those. And so we had a lot of conversations about death. And since then he's the person who I've done the most extensive ritual-based spirit work with. I got a table of practice based on his prompting in the lead up to the pandemic, which was really weird because he told me to stay in my job the year before because it was not going to change in 2020. And it didn't, because I work at a health lab.
Ah, there you go.
And I literally was never locked down. I was considered, but my job, the only difference in my job was I didn't see people very much. And that was after I had done all the table of practice work with him. And so he kind of broke my brain open in my 20s about death. And I had always never been as bothered by death as a lot of people. But the fact that I had died and hadn't really I experienced what you'd probably call like an ancestral experience. I basically remember being at a barbecue or party or something. It was very blurry, but that someone who felt like a grandmother was there and saying, "You're going to be okay. Just hang in there for a few minutes."
Yeah.
And she's like, "Well, we'll see you again at this party later." And yeah, I guess that could be heaven for some people, I guess, but it doesn't really fit with like any of the standard Christian stuff. But Moragel was telling me basically that what happens to people when they die is not set in stone. It varies from person to person. That human souls, the disposition of human souls is much more complicated than any singular religious belief. That basically all of them are sometimes true to some degree, but usually not in the ways that people think they are. And basically just that, yeah, okay, when you die, there's things that are, reincarnation is a thing. Some people do go to some place like a heaven or a hell, but those aren't necessary. It's not necessarily because of the way like it's taught in church. And usually has more to do with post-death purification processes and basically that you can't predict. I mean, you can kind of vaguely see, obviously, your Hitler or your Stalin or your
Ted Bundy, I don't know.
yeah, well, I was gonna go with like oh, never mind. Anyway, obviously some of them, your Rockefeller, there you go.
Oh, there you go.
Your Hitler, your Bundy, or your Rockefeller are gonna not be in a very happy disposition after death. Because if they're that miserable and that making other people miserable in life, then there is like that takes a toll on the human soul. But that it's not so, it basically just like all the rules kind of point towards roughly like the common sense moral rules of caring about people and not being terrible apply, but don't start trying to draw lines in the sand and saying, well, this is the right way to do things or this is the wrong way, because none of it is that well delineated. And varies from person to person. And
that sounds like an angel conversation right there. But
yeah, and well, I mean, and this took place on and off over several years, and I started getting into other, basically I branched out, and because I'd never really stopped being an animist in childhood. It'd just kind of been superseded by this like systematic spiritual pointing at sign gifts and stuff like that, because my parents had come out of a charismatic church that believed in sign gifts, and I literally believed the dead could be resurrected going into all this until honestly at this point I've kind of come back around and think that's probably possible. It's just super rare.
Yeah. Well, the other day I was just, it's a funny thing when you just float around the internet as part of your job. There's a little rabbit hole that I went down the other day around the rainbow body. I don't know if you've heard of it before.
Is that the Buddhist rainbow body?
Yeah, the Buddhist rainbow body. It's a Tibetan Buddhist practice, and it's one that through perfection of certain techniques at the moment of death, or sometimes beforehand, their physical body can either shrink to the point of transforming into light and rainbow light, particularly, leaving only hair and fingernails. And the thing that sort of sets this apart is the photographic evidence of this happening, the film analog photographic evidence of little dead monks that just get smaller and smaller. It's on the internet, folks. You can find it. And so there's, in terms of physical resurrection, I'm not going to rule it out, Kelsie. I'm right with you.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, and other stranger things of, like that kind of a transcendent shift. That's not so much it's an attaining immortality, but in a way that disperses the corporeal reality, corporeal body too. So it's still also kind of death.
Mm, mm. Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, the thing that I recall, even from a very young age, is that the actual physical death event never really held much fear for me personally, because while I couldn't recall past lives when I was young, very young, as I've gotten older, flashes of past lives have popped up with a kind of ineffable believability that makes me not doubt at all the fact that we come back or that we go somewhere else, let's just say somewhere else, after physical bodily death. And so for me, I've always held physical death as a transition, as a transitory event, rather than an absolute terminal ending point. And in that sense, I've never departed into atheism, even though for me it was academic study that probably presented the biggest challenge rather than stepping out of a religious community. But I've always seen it as a transition. And even when I've witnessed physical death, the process itself hasn't held any great mystery for me because it was simply that, a process without necessarily a conclusion that we can see, but with an ongoing sort of invisible aspect to it. And I'm kind of curious about your experiences with that, with death as a process of transition rather than a terminal ending. Is it something that you have come around to as an older person? Is it something that, with age?
Well, I think that's kind of how I always thought of it, and it hasn't. That's one of the things that hasn't really changed very much for me over the course of my life. Like, my view of what can happen in that process has become much more complex, but ultimately I don't think, I mean, if you'd asked me when I was a kid and an evangelical, I would have said something similar. I mean, there was a lady at my church who said that her dead daughter had visited her after her death, and she thought Jesus had brought her back to say goodbye. That was that was impactful. She was somebody. She cut my hair. She was the lady who cut my hair, and she was real good friends with my parents. And not she'd been all over kind of. And I remember my mom, who is still like very, like, she's actually much. I mean, she's become more conservative with age in some ways, but she always framed death as a change, not a sudden, not usually abrupt. I mean, probably it's abrupt if you die in a car accident and or meet some sudden violent end. And I think part of the reason we a lot of people tend to fear sudden violent ends is because of the idea of death being a jarring experience rather than, a gradual thing to come to terms with, which is, probably the majority experience. Even if you're dying of some kind of a terminal illness, you still have, you know, days or weeks or however much. And it seems like the more, obviously, if you have somebody who dies of old age, which I've had, like one of my grandparents died when I was an infant. One of my grandmothers did. My other grandmother died when I was a teenager, and that was kind of sudden. And that was much more jarring and more difficult in a lot of ways, even though in some ways it was probably less of a miserable death than my grandpa, who died of prostate cancer. So, although my grandpa who died of prostate cancer was also 95, so he was kind of just ready at that point. He was pretty much at the point where he was like, yeah, well, something's going to get me.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I appreciate a bit of humor around death, just simply because it can be a very heavy topic, obviously. And older people, they do tend to have that kind of dry, black humor around death. But the ones that I guess have made a place for it and have accepted the reality. But even the need, because we have a kind of luxury in the modern age to die sometimes with a very long tail end to our lives, whereas in previous times that probably wouldn't have been so much of a case. But in counterpoint to that, we've managed to kind of hide death really well
For
in
sure,
modern life,
which
right?
I don't like, and I have thought for a long time. Like, I really considered becoming a minister when I was in high school, and right when all the big shifts were happening for me, I was actually considering becoming a minister. And part of that was the idea of me wanting to minister to dying people. And I've come back to that idea periodically throughout my life, but I've never actually had any opportunities opened up in that direction. It's all been, talking to other people about it. So I guess what I tend to do more is try and just make it more of a natural thing to talk about. And because, death is inevitable and ever present, and it reminds me of how my mom always said, no, like, most people don't seem to want to talk about periods.
Mm. Mm.
People don't want to talk about, you know, bleeding and periods, and people don't want to talk about death. And there are these things that are like ever present, but they're vaguely taboo to talk about, at least to talk clearly about, which is partly because there's so much, symbolic. I think they have so much symbolic weight that people don't necessarily feel like they can talk clearly about them. They feel like you need to use metaphor, which makes sense because the kind of big mystery effects in life can cause us to bring a lot of stuff into question, obviously. And, talking about taboo topics also, if you talk about them, it can kind of affect how you view the world a lot, potentially. And so there's always this vague fear of we don't want to disrupt the status quo by talking too openly about the stuff that's right there that is just absolutely every day.
Well, if you never die, then you can just keep working. And there's a lot of power structures that are very heavily invested in extracting as much labor out of
That's
people
very
as
true.
possible. And if you go around thinking that, death's not going to happen to me, then every day can just be like the previous day in that sense. That creaking door is quite ominous, actually. I'm in the studio at the
That's
moment.
perfect. Very well underlining.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, look, I mean, for me personally, I've never been able to escape death. I've certainly been aware of spirits from a young age. I grew up opposite a gigantic cemetery. I'm from a small regional town in New South Wales called Newcastle, and the part of Newcastle that I grew up in, a suburb called Sandgate, has like one of the largest cemeteries in Australia, literally just across the road. So I sort of was just, as a matter of fact, day to day kind of aware of death because I had to walk through the cemetery to get to the train station to get to school. And it's never like studying philosophy, I think, is kind of a kind of outgrowth of that because according to a lot of, old-timey philosophers, the point of studying philosophy is to have a good death, basically, to prepare your life so that you can transition in a good way. And it sounds morbid, and it certainly sounded morbid to me, those aspects of it when I was studying it. If you just assume that where we are now is just all there is, yeah, because it seems like a waste of a lifetime. But if you're naturally tuned in to what happens beyond the veil, or if through experience you get awakened to that, or if just through age and just being alive for long enough, you start to kind of reconcile with the reality of death, then the door, not unlike the creaking one that we just had drop into the recording, will open and you can glimpse what's on the other side. And with the client work that I do as a tarot reader and astrologer, there's sometimes cause to talk about people who have passed away. I'm not a medium in as much as I can't coherently communicate just ad hoc with people who have passed over. But I'm wondering if there's, in the work that you do with other people, whether that's paid or just those other conversations that you have with friends and sometimes strangers from time to time, how do you find that aspect of being the intermediary? And I guess sort of talking about the physical reality, but also bringing in something that's very unique and not a lot of other people have, which is that spirit contact element.
Yeah, it's interesting because even in like mundane contexts, like in the office that I work at, if death comes up, I tend to be skilled at putting people at their ease, I think, assuming I'm reading the room correctly. But a lot of it to me, because you mentioned the veil, and I have an interesting, like the veil brought up a lot as a concept to me because I think the idea of the veil is the veil.
Mm-hmm.
And let me explain what I mean by that. I
Yeah, sure.
think that the idea of there being a hard and fast separation between life and death is an artificial product of Western European culture. pretty much. I don't think the veil exists outside of human minds. But that being said, human minds are exceedingly powerful, especially when they all get together and gang up and decide something like money is real or countries are real. So the veil isn't not real, it's just only real in as much as any of these other hypothetical dividing lines are.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Or gender. Like,
Yeah,
it's
of
like
course.
all these lines are like, these are all made up cultural things that we use as guidelines to try and relate to each other by signposts. And this is all, a product of language. And I studied philosophy and religion the first time I was in college, which I dropped out of because, I was preparing for divinity school. And then I dropped out of because of this giant meltdown, right? And I started getting this idea in my philosophy classes. And I had some really great, I was going to a Christian college, and I had a lot of these professors were really good. Like, they were actually pretty open-minded, because once you get to being, you've been a pastor, but you're also teaching philosophy and you're teaching world religions, and you're trying to do so with some kind of respectful collegiality. And it gets it a lot into, like, how do we think our thoughts? Why do we think this way? Well, mostly a lot of it for us is downstream of the Greeks.
Of course, we are a Greek people, my friend.
And so we wind up inheriting a lot of that baggage, going all the way back, and just piling more baggage on top of that baggage. And we wind up with, the history of philosophy is something I feel like, that's one of my problems with modern, academic materialist atheism, is that they just don't know the history of where their ideas come from.
Oh my God, yes. No, there was a lot of tripping balls back then. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but there was definitely a lot more of that because of the weird nature of this liminal university that was Christian, but also in a really weird place at the time. It's not. It's they've gone off the deep end, like hardcore right wing now, but it used to be kind of a liberal institution, that one. And so I got that, and then when I went back to school to try and get just a piece of paper to use for work, to find jobs and such, I studied anthropology and focused a lot on magic and spiritual beliefs of people all over, particularly East Asia and South Asia. That's kind of what I focused a lot. I didn't get I got a minor in Asian studies and focused a lot of that around Asian religion, both in the Indian subcontinent originated ones, and Chinese and Japanese, and more less organized indigenous type religions. And where was I going with this?
The veil is a function of language. No. This is this is totally right within my wheelhouse, mate. Go for it.
Yeah. So the idea of there being a hard separation between life and death just completely ignores all the ancestor practices of probably 80% of the human population. Yep. Of the planet right now. It's like, and just the same as the idea of ignoring the idea that spiritual experience is real. It's really a product of Western colonialism, and trying to frame it as, oh, look at this, superstitious stuff that these brown people did or do. So that gives us an excuse to come in and civilize them. And then also you can weaponize it again once you become, eventually, colonialism went, we can dispense with the monotheism. We can start re-exploiting the, working class monotheists by saying, well, look at you dumb shits, thinking that spirits are real.
Yeah.
And just extend it to everybody, basically, who's not rich.
Yeah, well, I guess anybody who's kind of got some labor left in them as well. Not to go too much into the anti-capitalist kind of rant, but a lot of those practices, those colonial practices, were extractive, and they're extractive for a reason, which is to kind of feed the promulgation of oppression as a means of accumulating capital.
For sure, and academia is built right on top as a reinforcing agent for that, in my perspective. That's why I couldn't keep, because I had a bunch of professors when I finished up that anthropology degree, because I kept talking about how the way that anthropology works, you've got to treat the magic and the people's practices and their spiritual beliefs as being actually real.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're still being, you're still falling for the classic issue of ethnocentric anthropology that reinforces colonialism. And so you can't just be like, oh yeah, well, we know better, but let's look at these quaint people from wherever, right? And I'm like, no, you got to treat it as real. Otherwise, you're just doing the thing that you're pretending not to do it.
Well, there was that. There's like a practice or a methodology in anthropology back when fieldwork was a thing where you totally immerse yourself. I'm not sure what the technical term is. I'm not an anthropologist.
Oh, and I'm out of school for 10 years. It's cultural, what is it? It's, oh man, I should remember that, but
No, it's okay.
it's been a long day
No.
opening up my writing website and
Yeah. No, that's totally okay. Look, the point I wanted to make was there's definitely like a branch of anthropology where full cultural immersion in the belief systems as well as everything else of the particular peoples that you're studying is the methodology. And the outcomes of that aren't necessarily comprehensible to the academic framework from which that methodology comes from, because it's two different languages. There's a need for an intermediary point where a lot of that experience, which is knowledge, which is wisdom, and which is experiential and can't be obtained any other way, still needs to be, I guess, separated from the experience itself and pushed through a sieve of academic terminology and very specific language.
yes, the sieve. I like
the
that.
sieve. Yeah.
Yeah, it's cultural anthropology does participant observation.
Participant observation.
Participant observation and reflexive writing to and analyze your own response to what you're seeing rather than trying to say, well, this is what they're doing. You go, well, this is what it seems like from my perspective is happening, to kind of like it's an acknowledgement of, yeah, I'm an outsider. So I'm going to have an outsider perspective, but also valuing an outsider perspective. And that's how cultural anthropology is supposed to work. But in academic institutions, which most anthropology is based around, then it, runs into all this trying to publish things and go through the respectability politics of getting stuff published. And I see you shaking your head, and it's,
toe the party line,
anybody who's engaged with academia much at all knows exactly that whole thing.
Oh yeah. No, one of the things that got me out of it was just not falling into that battery hen kind of, you must produce eggs. I had much more of a free range sort of approach to publication, in that I just didn't publish anything as a PhD student, and so I had less than zero chance really of getting a job afterwards. But it's an interesting function of language though to construct things like veils, right?
Yes.
Because there's got to be a necessity. There's got to be some sort of necessity. Now, if you ask a Gnostic, it's going to be, oh, we're just being convinced that this is all there is by the demiurge, and it's bad, and you need to kind of break out of that. But to talk about death is also to talk in a funny way about birth, and I'm not trying to be glib, but what I'm getting towards is, if we die, then why were we born? Right? That's the big question that I have. And if we're born, why are we born into a worldview, at least in the West, right, that has some sort of veil built in or baked into the cultural and linguistic framework that we use to sort of learn about the world around us? And I'm wondering if there's insights that you've gleaned through personal experience and working with spirits about the reasons why we go through the birth-death process. Because I'm in a bit of a samsara mindset at the moment about it, which is that there's just this wheel and we've got to escape it by accumulating merit and not being an asshole, basically.
Well, so I have kind of an weirdly, because I've definitely embraced the idea of reincarnation as being probably the most common, like some form of reincarnation. Because I also think most people have more than one part of their essential self, that some parts of those transcend death and some go other places. I have been playing a lot with Taoism for the last 5 or 8 years or so, and a lot of my current understanding, which will obviously continue to evolve on up until my death and on through into what comes next for me. But a lot of my understanding of that is that part of why we go through this process is a learning and self-betterment experience, but that it's not to escape a cycle, that it's to embrace and to basically to embrace what we have in the here and now, and to help other people to learn to experience, kind of a transcendental awareness of a self that is not just here, just now. That it goes forward and backward and in fun little dancing loops sometimes. And it sucks sometimes. And sometimes it's amazing. But things are more likely to suck less, I think, if you try and maintain some kind of an outlook of the purpose of me being here is to work through what I'm working through.
Yeah.
That it's kind of so not to step out and go, I'm not trying to transcend existence in some way. I've had transcendental experiences, but some of the most transcendental experiences I've had have been ones that are focused around engaging on a level of deep sensing with the stars outside in the dark and the wind blowing and all the insects making noise and hearing things move in the woods and leaves blow in the wind and the trees swaying and creaking and just being present without overthinking it.
Yeah. Well,
I value, I'm a pretty cerebral person, but the idea to me that I try and work through is how you can have all these cerebral ideas, big cosmic notions, but at the end of the day, what I think is most valuable is feeling like you're in the right place in your life and being fairly happy with that. So it's kind of interesting because I agree with a lot of the process of Buddhism and Hinduism in various branches as I understand them, because I know they're practiced very, very differently in different contexts. Was recently realized I was overgeneralizing some about a particular Buddhist practice that I didn't realize was being practiced in ways that I didn't even know. And I was like, oh yeah, don't forget, I don't actually practice this. Reminder to self.
Oh, yeah.
Don't be arrogant and think you know everything, because there's just too much.
Just thinking about what you've shared about the process of remaining present. I mean, two things pop up to mind. The first one is that old saying, the Tao is big, my friend. The second of all, that's a very Taoist way of thinking about existence, because there's a few concepts that are baked into that. Like I could sort of feel the sort of way wu wei kind of approach there, which is there's a way, but it's not the way. And the transcendental urge, right, has been with me personally for as long as I can remember, and that's part of the reason why I don't fear death, because I've always been trying to get back where I came from. It's not that I have memories of being in the intermediary state between life and death. I can kind of remember past lives, that's about it. But I do get this overwhelming feeling of there's a home, but the home isn't here. And that could be just my moon in Sagittarius talking.
Oh no,
right?
I mean, I've had that a lot because of how liminal my experiences are. I don't feel super at home. It's part of why I value the moments that I do feel at home, because they are so rare. I mean, there's plenty of times when I'll be stuck in this some kind of hypercosmic mindset. I've smoked a little weed and I'll be sitting there thinking about some of my spirit allies and spirit family and ancestors, and thinking on these like hypercosmic time scales. And then somebody, I don't necessarily always know, it's not always the same like spirits, or sometimes it's one of my kids, will just, say or do something, and I'll be there in the moment instead of like trying to stretch myself across all of time and space. I was like, no, actually, this is, I mean, and interestingly, shifting from the one into the other can really be helpful, because it's like, yeah, these are actually the same thing. The as above, so below, but also as below, so above.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And that's the thing. I think what we do here matters. I don't think it doesn't matter, But I think the ways that it matters are in ways that are like, well, I have special interests in like fractals and I always get talking about like 5-dimensional helixes and stuff like that. But with that being ripples in a multi-dimensional pond, and anything, all the experiences, the big experiences in our life ripple outwards and have effects through all these other times and other lives, and I think other realities, which is kind of what I'm trying to work through some of that with my writing. I had a visionary experience of myself one time when I was suicidal when I was about 26, and because I was really mad. I'm like, why am I being put through this? This is bullshit. Like, what kind of a cruel God would do this to me? And I literally showed up in this ecstatic visionary experience of an older feminine version of myself and said, well, sorry to tell you, but the person who's doing this is me. I'm you. And you have to go through this to get to where you're going to write about this experience. So this writing experience this writing ritual that I've just like started, part of what happens along the way with it is I write about that experience from this end of it.
Yeah.
And I'm writing those words for myself in the past.
I'll channel my inner Gordon here and say it is all just happening at the level of the field.
Yeah, for sure. Sure. What does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I know, right? But it makes sense. He's got a habit of being infuriatingly right. But let's talk about writing, though. Yes. Today's a monumental day for you, first of all. I got you on to talk about death, but you've had other things on, mate, earlier in the day. So you're a writer, you're a creative writer, as well as being a medium and occultist.
I've been writing in creative ways since I was in high school. I've had a couple tiny, like, things published by publishers that don't exist anymore. And like one of them was just like in a college newspaper, of course, so it doesn't really count. But it's just like I've been writing all this time, and all of it's built around me trying to figure out something about why I'm here is about writing weird ideas down for other people. And it's funny because I haven't really put most of what I've written out there. I've written a couple spells. I've got a pretty good warding spell, but none of that's. My hosting service collapsed and doesn't exist anymore. So like all the things that have gone towards what I'm doing right now have all felt preparatory. And but also this writing process was launched about setting up, because I've been writing. I've obviously got a lot of material floating around to be potentially used as bases for putting a creative writing project up. And what this project is it's a Substack that is, it's not just going to be a Substack, theoretically. I think it's going to there'll be a podcast rebooted at some point, because I tried a podcast at one point and that didn't really work for various reasons, but I think it's supposed to be a piece of it. And the idea for all of this work is that it's going to be about hyper-sigilling a life retroactively. And a lot of it's down to that experience when I met myself and said, yeah, you're writing all this for a reason. So a lot of it is memoirs that are loosely fictionalized and serialized, including a lot of places that I've engaged with via my journeying practice, which has been right there. I kind of started journeying as a form of magical technology when I was a child with books, because I would sit around imagining myself into these worlds. And I never kind of stopped doing that. But at some point I started figuring out how to kind of ritualize that in ways that wound up having effects in my life that couldn't be ignored. Like, just really crazy stuff. It is a really weird life sometimes. But part of the whole point, I think, is just for people to realize that life does not fit into the boxes that people want it to necessarily fit into, and to think bigger. Like, I'm into Charles Fort, and I really hope that we will see in the next, as our society is drastically changing in the next few years, a shift towards the idea of the Fortean dominant of wider inclusion, where or witchcraft, or I think those were the two words Fort used. I'm not sure either of those are really the best words, but the idea that just people will stop quite as much grinding away in these very specific lanes and saying everyone else is wrong.
It's really interesting that you've chosen writing as the medium to do that. And I'm going to include writing, I'm going to include podcasting in with writing, which is, leaving your thoughts, leaving your viewpoints in mediums that keep going even when you're not. So just to tie it into death a little bit, because, I'm in a happy mood today. Well, I'm thinking about Plato, and I'm thinking about the dialogue, the Phaedrus, where Plato is, through the medium of Socrates, literal medium of Socrates, mind you, just read Plato a bit closer, you'll find it. But instructing Phaedrus about the dangers of writing, because the person who says the words isn't there to defend themselves or defend the writing. And written words can carry on long after the author's dead. And there's this necessary distance that pops into writing. And your goals that you've just described, you're putting this through a medium that's kind of inherently going to keep going after you drop off the perch, so to speak. And I'm fascinated by that, right? Because if you're looking to kind of keep people from stepping into lanes, and if your sort of subject matter is sort of hypersigiling a life retrospectively, then there's got to be an element in which the words that you make will continue to evolve through interpretation after you go through that physical transition of bodily death. And do you think that's hypersigillic? That sounds a bit hypersigil-ish to me.
Yes, and that was part of the plan.
Ah, cool.
Because part of the plan is for it to be a book for my descendants.
Yeah, okay, cool. Nice.
Preferably, if any of them are interested, for them to add to it.
Ooh.
And to expand on it in different ways. So I'm actually writing, they're not written, but there's a couple of characters who are in the process of being written into, they're not going to be added, I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just starting the actual posting on any of this. And so as much as I've been planning it for 10 years, I have no idea. As they say in the military, no plan survives first contact with the enemy.
Yeah.
So I have no idea what this is going to go like as far as time goes. But I want people to literally be able to take this and write their own. I don't want it to be considered because I've struggled with the idea. I definitely do not want to found a religion or something. But I want to have a philosophical effect on humans downstream, particularly the ones like my kids, and I want to have an effect that benefits the world. I want my time here to have been valuable in a way that helps other people. I want to be a good ancestor. I'm trying to be a good ancestor right now. So I want people to read my ideas, and as ridiculous as some of them are going to be, I want people to respond to that, and I want people to be prompted to do their own version. Do something that... One of my favorite things in literature is seeing the historical progression of literature and how writers reference other writers and how they build on other writers' ideas. And because this is very representative of how just human thought works in general, right? We operate through symbols that we exchange, and that these symbols are stories, right? Whether you're talking religion or science or engineering or whatever field you want to try and break things down into, it's all based on stories. The stories that we tell each other that let us grow together and in our own ways. In that wonderful, delightful, liminal way that humans in general have, right? And so I want people to engage with these completely woo-woo out there weird ideas, but that are hopefully entertaining enough and engaging enough that people will think, well, I want to play with that idea. I want to write something. I want to make a play. I want to sing a song. I want to make visual art. And it's my spouse is really into fan fiction, and I'm not very big into fan fiction as far as actually consuming it or producing it, but I love it as an idea because I kind of think of all of modern human culture as fanfic of ancient human culture.
Ooh, that's a nice take.
We're all kind of we're all reflecting our ancestors, right? And we're all reflecting the composites of all the stories that we've gotten from all sides and all those different lanes of ancestry that we have, whether it's physical ancestry or cultural ancestry that we've all picked up in completely unique ways. And those stories, we're all writing our own lives based on those stories. And so the idea is that if each of our lives is a story and we're all telling stories together, then I want what I am living in my life to be a story that's worth other people basing part of their story on.
Yeah, well, there's kind of degrees to which you can holographically project out the configuration of your life way in this lifetime so that forms part of that deeper holographic hyperfractal construction of whatever lineage is. Because it's funny, like we construct things like borders and countries and genders and the boundaries between things.
Or colors.
Or colours, or we have this thing called language that we don't seem to be able to very easily, at least, think outside of. Yeah, it's hard not to label things as a means of comprehending them to the end of like mechanizing your thought processes.
Well, see, this is where I know I'm neurodivergent because I actually have to stack language intentionally.
Yeah,
and I think that's part of why I like it so much because language is like this fascinating artifact because when I'm engaging with thought processes, it's like recorded memories, like complex stacks of sensory data that are stacked together and the feelings of them move through my mind as a story, but that doesn't have words. It's like those experiences playing one on top of the other. And at some point, somewhere I have to sort through those and go, okay, well, what actually gets transferred into words? And I spent a lot of, I was really not very articulate when I was first engaging with when I was first going to public school. I liked to growl at people, and I was bullied a lot, let's say, because I didn't like using words the same way as other people. And the words that I did have were all these complicated ones because I was homeschooled by nerdy adults and and I didn't understand why, I don't know, it's hard to understand why people think of words as solid things to me.
Well, if you want a different understanding of language, try spirit contact, because that would have changed your idea of language. It certainly changed my idea of language. Just communicating with spirits to the limited capacity that I do. And I guess what really changed it for me was communicating with angelic intelligences, because they just give you these fucking hypercubes of information that unpack themselves over time once they're sort of here in the linear time space or whatever it is, the illusion of time on this plane of existence. And I guess, you can't help but let that influence the way that you write and the way that you do creative work.
For sure. And that's kind of like without the concentrated levels of experience. I mean, I think I do experience pretty concentrated levels of story, but it's definitely different from spirit contact, where you can just be completely overwhelmed if you're not careful.
Oh, Jesus, tell me about it.
And I think part of why I'm doing what I'm doing is, and why I'm supposed to be doing this, is because I was kind of set up to be more accessible and to be able to process this stuff. Because I don't think I would have survived a lot of this stuff that I've gone through if I hadn't had early spirit contact and always been thinking. Like, it's one of those chicken and egg things. Like, I am in this life where I definitely think a lot different from a lot of people because of all this liminality going on. But part of the purpose of that is, I think, to make it so that I didn't die. I didn't stay dead.
Yeah, so you didn't stay dead. And that maybe you won't stay dead next time as well. Maybe
Yeah,
you'll come
well,
back.
and they had the whole, yeah, I don't know. There was something I was going with that, but that idea that humans can be more than a lot of us are. I think. Well, I think. Well, let me rephrase that. I think humans are more than a lot of people think they are.
Mm.
I love being human. It's such a wonderful experience to be able to be this complex and liminal, and I want other people to see that in their own lives. That humans in general are as liminal as we'll let ourselves be. I think that's part of how we maybe, if we're involved in the picking of our lives, which I think a good number of us are, that we pick our lives based on what we think we're capable of handling and what we think we need to learn and experience, just as part of our own overall growth process. And that's probably being redundant with some of the stuff I said earlier, and it's definitely not where I started that statement.
Well, it's a beautiful sentiment, I think, to maybe pause and recognize that the Tao has led us here. And
Yes.
maybe you can tell people, because, like, first of all, where's that damn Substack, Kelsie? Because I'm going to sign up, and I want
Okay.
other people to sign up too. So maybe you can have a chat about how people can learn more about your work and participate in that hypersigil, because it sounds fun.
Yeah, and comments are open. If I get any people being assholes in the comments, I'll be trying to do something about that. Hopefully we don't get too. Hopefully this is niche enough that it doesn't attract too many of the internet assholes. But it is amusing muse, all one word, .substack.com, and it's definitely like a musing muse or amusing muse. I'm doing a lot of and please, I hope if anyone out there is hung up on spelling errors, there are a lot of intentional misspellings in this, because that was what I was going to say. Actually, I was going to ask you if you'd read Jerusalem by Alan Moore.
Oh, I haven't read Jerusalem. No, I haven't.
Okay, well, it is a daunting read. I will not make any bones about it. But what you were talking about with the giant downloads you get with angelic intelligences, he fits some of the best words around that I've ever seen fit around it. And that's actually pretty early in the book. So if the rest of it is so it definitely was inspiring to me, because it was like, oh, this is like the kind of shit that I'm trying to write. Because I was already starting on this project when Alan Drake said, you really need to read Jerusalem, and he hadn't finished it yet. And I'm like, okay, I'll read it. And so I started reading it. I'm like, oh man, yeah, this is what I needed right now to kick my pants, so that I'd get to writing seriously, because I feel like in some way, I try and be in conversation with a lot of other writers, particularly kind of obscure. Like, my podcast idea was originally to just read old, out of copyright material that has been significantly influential in like Western genre literature, like supernatural literature in general, basically. And I got 4 episodes in to The Great God Pan and realized that I had done 2 voices to where they were very similar, and that I was not going to be able to record that next episode anytime soon without going back and re-recording a bunch of stuff, because otherwise I was going to have 2 people talking in the same voice to each other.
Good luck on the podcast journey is all I've got to say. If you don't like going back and fixing things and editing stuff and what have you.
Yeah, no, I think I'm just going to reboot the whole thing this year. Once I've got the Substack thing a little bit more ironed out, like the pace that I'm going at it. But Alan Moore in that book is in dialogue with so many other writers, and that's a big thing that he's doing. And it's like he has the hardest part of the book. Well, maybe not the hardest part, but one of the more complicated parts of the book. He writes in Joycean, so James Joyce style language.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah,
there's a whole section where these ghost kids, who are amazing, like he has a gang of ghost kids called the Dead Gang, and that's some of the most joyful stuff with these this gang of this British kid gang, like an urchin gang.
Yeah.
Who are all dead. They're all ghosts.
The Dead Gang, and he's writing like Joyce. Fantastic.
Yeah, well, they go and they visit Joyce's daughter.
Yeah, right.
Who was not a spoiler at all. The whole thing is about his hometown.
Mm-hmm.
And Northampton being the heart of England, basically, for good and bad. And deals with angels, angles, looking at things from different angels, and finding angels in angles. That's the whole kind of start of it. And he wrote himself into it, so it's also kind of a hyper sigil.
Yeah.
So I recommend it if you want to, I listened to the audiobook, which was pretty impressive, and was 90 hours long. The book is humongous. Okay. And parts of it are a little, what am I reading here? What are we going through? But it's anybody who has read it, if they like that sort of thing, they might like my blog. If they didn't like it, they probably wouldn't like my thing, but they might. And I'm also interspersing with the sort of metafictional hyper sigil memoir elements. I'm also interspersing just kind of every 3 or 4 chapters I'm writing about writing in a purely as much as anything is nonfiction in my life, writing about what I think about writing and my process that I'm going through. And so I'd really like people to be in dialogue with me on those in particular, people who are creative writers or other creatives in various ways, because that's what I want to do. I want to facilitate dialogue about creativity and thinking outside the boxes that we find ourselves in and putting ourselves into artistic liminal story dialogue with our lives and the lives of those around us.
Nice one, mate. That sounds juicy as fuck. I can't wait to get into it. And I'm going to link to your Substack in the show notes. I'll also link to a few other things that we discussed today as well. So thank you so much for dropping by. Kelsie, that was amazing. That was really, really good to have you on. It was really fun. It was cool, man. And Saturnine in the very best sense.
Oh, and I launched this morning because of the Cazimi.
Yeah.
The Cazimi with Mercury, I managed to grab the Cazimi with Mercury and Saturn. It's not in a good house necessarily, but I actually managed to put the MC against my AC.
Ooh, wow.
And when I launched everything, I did a petition to Venus especially to please don't fuck this up because it's square the whole thing. Please don't make me hate that I've decided to do this.
Oh, mate, look, I think just based on your description of what you're aiming to achieve with the blog, those with ears to hear will hear that Sun, Saturn, Mercury in Pisces, Cazimi just talking straight through the whole thing. This is a really good one, guys. I'm going to link to it. You've got to go check it out. I can't wait.
I'm excited to have talks with people about it. Other weirdos who are interested in weird stuff.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Kelsie, thank you so much for dropping by, man. All the best with that Substack. Let's get you back on real soon, too.
Thanks, Matt. I loved it. This was great.